Over a decade ago, Satoshi Nakamoto swooped down out of a bright blue sky like a screaming eagle of freedom and rained down upon us a monetary instrument unlike any we had ever seen. It was a coin that knew no master. There was no central authority who could inflate it beyond its scheduled emissions or freeze anyone's holdings. This was a masterless coin designed to promote economic freedom. In the intervening years, this freedom suffered innumerable perversions in the name of programmability and progress that only created new masters. Then along came a glimmer of hope, a path back to that original freedom, a spiritual successor to Bitcoin that embraced programmability but still preserved that original freedom. It was called Cardano, and it featured true liquid staking and real native assets so that your coins would have no master but you. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss some important comments made in the latest Cardano 360, an interesting thread that indirectly explains why Cardano's true liquid staking is so slept on, a great thread on Validator recovery in Nakamoto consensus versus BFT, and a new Coty article laying out some minimums for Djed and Shen that many may not have expected. If you looked at this image and couldn't decide if the eagle was dropping off a bunch of crypto coins or just a bunch of cornflakes he didn't like of some type, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Also, some of you have probably noticed that the Cardano Foundation delegation has now left us. That's a rotating delegation. They sort of select pools, and then you get to keep that delegation for a set amount of time, and then they rotate it to other pools. So nothing changes really on our end too much, but thank you to the Cardano Foundation for selecting us and for the time we had it. The recent Cardano 360 made some important observations about these overarching, bigger picture differences between what Cardano is building right now and what the rest of the crypto landscape seems to be aimed at. The episode started out like normal with Tim Harrison, and pretty soon he brought on Vineeth Bhuvanagiri of Emergo, who talked about USDA, their new stablecoin, and Anzens. Anzens is the regulatorily compliant product suite meant to bridge the real world and the DeFi world. And we've talked about both USDA and Anzens before on this channel. USDA will have monthly attestations to prove they're 100% backed. They're trying to get a SOC 2 compliance audit underway, and they're designing their smart contracts so that they can freeze minting and burning capabilities if there's any mismatch between the minted coins and the funds representing those coins. And I know in crypto in general and in Cardano, we freak out whenever anybody talks about freezing anything. But note, he's talking about freezing, minting, and burning here. He's not talking about freezing the assets. And we'll get to that in just a second. And the comments he's going to make about that are, I think, a good explanation of why what Cardano's building is so different than what we've got going on in the greater crypto landscape. He talked about tokenization of real world assets as well, like precious metals, and how they can include info regarding those assets in the Cardano metadata. He also mentioned that Cardano native assets are great in that no one has a big red button to freeze your assets, but that presents some regulatory hurdles. I really like that he said this, because certainly there are some regulatory hurdles. We've seen in a lot of the rest of the crypto world, in the EVM world, in the account balance world, the assets beyond the base layer assets are really citizens of smart contracts. They're created by those smart contracts, and whatever is programmed into those smart contracts is going to govern those assets, including the ability for a centralized authority, a centralized party, to freeze assets in that smart contract. And what we've seen with stable coins frequently, that is the case. there's some centralized authority who can freeze your Tether or your USDC or whatever stablecoin we're talking about generally. The reason they've done this is because the entities behind those stablecoins, they're in it to make some money. They're in it for the profit, and the way they're dealing with pressure from regulators to do certain things. Because I mean, obviously, this is crypto, and a stablecoin in crypto very possibly is going to end up in the hands of some bad guys, according to some government. Some government is not going to like somebody that your stablecoin ends up in the hands of. And what they're immediately going to request you do is freeze those assets. Freeze those assets so they cannot be spent by the bad guys. And what Vineeth is talking about here is the fact that that's not how it works in Cardano. In Cardano, our tokens, along with our NFTs, are native assets. They're first-class citizens of the blockchain. They're not the product of smart contracts. They are just like ADA. If you have the private keys to those native assets, nobody can really freeze them unless you've, entangled them in some script somehow voluntarily. If you've done something with your native assets, you've deposited them with someone, something like that. But if they're just sitting there, in your own wallet, in your own self-custody wallet, if you've got them on your ledger, if it's on a hardware wallet, there's no central authority out there who can freeze those Cardano native assets. This is a very different circumstance than what we've seen in the EVM world. Vineeth, in my opinion, is rightly pointing out here that this is great for the user because there's nobody out there who can push that button and freeze your assets. But it does create some regulatory hurdles for the projects in some cases. But when I think about sort of this balancing of the freedom of ownership of assets, which is what we're really after in crypto. I mean, let's face it, that's one of the base assumptions you were making about crypto right after you read the Satoshi white paper. One of the great things was this freedom to own the asset and no one to be able to freeze your assets or to be able to inflate your assets into nothingness. I mean, that freedom of ownership was a big piece of what you probably thought about crypto right after reading the Satoshi white paper or, whatever it was, hearing about Bitcoin for the first time from a friend or hearing about Cardano from a friend or watching the Charles Whiteboard video, something like that. This true freedom of ownership is a big piece of what's so attractive about crypto. And I would compare Cardano native assets when people try to instantly compare them to tokens in the EVM world that can be frozen in some cases, in many cases. I wouldn't make that comparison. I would compare them more to Bitcoin. The reason we've seen all this regulatory activity in the Ethereum world, in the EVM world, in the account balance world, is because assets can be frozen. We haven't seen that in the Bitcoin world. You don't see regulators going to, the non-existent central authority in the Bitcoin world asking someone to freeze Bitcoin. Okay, maybe, some regulators would love it if they could do that, but it can't really be done. So it's not really an issue. You don't worry about someone freezing your Bitcoin, just like you don't worry about someone freezing your ADA, just like you don't worry about someone freezing your Cardano native tokens, because it's not a part of the system. They're not, those assets aren't the product of a smart contract that has been programmed to allow for those things. So while it is a regulatory hurdle, I kind of think it's only a regulatory hurdle to the extent that that's suffered as to BTC. So it's going to be interesting. Certainly, stable coins are a different matter. Stable coins are going to be under much, much more regulatory pressure. As near as I can tell, regulators don't talk about regulating Bitcoin per se, but they do talk a lot about regulating stable coins. So what's going to happen when they come to a Cardano native asset that's a stable coin and they want to regulate it, and whoever issued that stablecoin looks at them and says, hey, it's already in the wallets of the users. We don't have a way to freeze those assets. We don't have a way to control them. They're out in the wild and we can't pull them back. There's no mechanism to do it. this is a very different circumstance for Cardano. Vineeth also thinks the right place for regulation to exist is when you're bridging real world assets to the digital world. So when you're going from real world assets like dollars or euros, yen, whatever, to the digital world, that's where you should regulate at the on ramp. And at the end of the day, if a blockchain can be, so here I'm separating on ramps and blockchains, but he says at the end of the day, if a blockchain can be regulated, then it's not really a blockchain. I would agree strongly with this. And I would also say that crypto assets that can be frozen are not really crypto assets. If you ask me, is USDC really a crypto asset? Is Tether a crypto asset? If you also tell me that each of those can be frozen, then I would say they're not really a crypto asset. That's kind of a semi-centralized asset because there are entities behind those stable coins that are trying to be regulatory compliant. I mean, they're not like evil. They're just trying to be regulatorily compliant. And, they're freezing assets when they're asked to. So I don't think they're necessarily doing anything wrong. I would just say those aren't true crypto assets, not in the sense that Bitcoin and ADA and Cardano native assets are. So we also gave a little more practical information. He said on launch day, USDA will be available to US citizens via debit, credit, ACH, or wire. For everyone else, it'll of course be in the secondary markets, probably very quickly. They'll expand outside the US on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. There's currently a wait list at anzens.com that you can join to get the latest information. I think crypto is starting to sort of fall in these different buckets. You've got sort of the EVM world, which seems to always be going in this direction of slightly more centralized, slightly more regulatory compliant, slightly less Bitcoin, slightly less, this rebel masterless money. And then you've got Cardano and Bitcoin, which are very much, no coincidence, they're both UTXO, but also both going in this direction of masterless money, this money that falls outside of the normal structures. And maybe that's going to create some regulatory hurdles, maybe not. But I would argue that everything's worked out just fine for Bitcoin. Bitcoin certainly has not fit within any regulatory framework so far. There's no one who can really do anything. I mean, they can certainly try to regulate it, but there's no party that can do anything because it's not, there's no central authority to be addressed. There was never a Satoshi to be served by any regulator. And while the sort of founder part is not the same with Cardano, we do see with Cardano native assets this similar kind of trend toward it being this masterless money. It's the attempts are being made to make it as decentralized as possible. Sort of this alternate bucket that Bitcoin and Cardano are fitting in, where they're not creating Lidos, that have this immense amount of control. They're not there aren't these smart contracts that the tokens are citizens of. Things just ride on the blockchain, and there's no once they're issued and out there, there's no centralized authority who can really do anything with those assets. If you have the private keys to those assets, those are yours. You are the sole master of those coins. There's no third party who always has that other switch they can pull and freeze your coins. This is a very different sort of category of crypto than the EVM world. And it also lines up with what they're trying to do with the Edinburgh Decentralization Index. So the next topic in the Cardano 360 was about the EDI. And we heard from Professor Agalos Kiais and others who explained that the goal is really to have very transparent data on a variety of different layers of a blockchain so that anyone can follow how they arrived at a score. I think this is really important. So obviously, because Cardano is sort of sponsoring this project, there are going to be the inevitable accusations of bias. So what they're going for is a methodology to arrive at this Edinburgh Decentralization Index score for each project that anyone can follow. They want to make all the data transparent and the methodology very transparent so that people can follow, like, hey, here's the methodology, and we can debate the methodology, but here's exactly how they arrived at that score. I think this is absolutely the right way to go about this. They want users to be able to see exactly how decentralized a blockchain really is because, of course, it affects security. The more centralized a blockchain is, the more damaging that is to its security. So this is something that's been glossed over for a long time in crypto. We just sort of ignore the Nakamoto coefficient in Bitcoin. We just sort of ignore the Nakamoto coefficient in Ethereum. They're both bad. And I think this is going to shine a little bit more light on that. And people are going to start caring a lot more about decentralization when they're suddenly faced with the glaring deficit in the scores of the Bitcoin and Ethereum ecosystems compared to other ecosystems like Cardano. In this Cardano 360, they also talk to Genius Shield and Paribus, and I'll let you go watch those segments if you are interested in those projects. We just talked about how Cardano having these masterless coins, these native assets, is such a huge advantage for people in the Cardano ecosystem. Here's a thread that sort of indirectly explains why having true liquid staking is such a huge advantage over what we see in, say, the Ethereum ecosystem, where they say they have liquid staking, but they're only achieving it via derivatives. And we've talked before on this channel how when you go to the website for Lido, the largest provider of the staked ETH staking derivative instrument through which Ethereum holders are achieving liquidity even when their Ether is staked. When we look at their website, if you go to risk factors right on their website, it always shows you these same, I think there's 5 or 7 risk factors. And I believe 2 of them were more related to the beacon chain, but one of them is always that their derivative instrument, the one that is providing you with this liquidity, could depeg. The staked ETH could depeg from Ether. And I think a lot of people are just sort of gliding past that and not worrying about it. But this thread explains exactly why you should worry about that, why that's not the same as true liquidity that you get in Cardano. So this thread is from this poster who says, according to his profile, he is a director at Coinbase and previously at Bridgewater. He says, on June 8th, 2022, 2 mystery wallets withdrew 75 million plus of staked ETH from FTX. I'm assuming he's using sort of US convention here. This could be August 6th if he's going for European format there. But last summer, basically, either in June or August, depending on what format he's using, they then proceeded to market sell everything, kicking off a DPEG event seen as one of the contributing factors to Celsius's bank run and the demise of 3AC. So 2 mystery wallets. We know today that SBF and Alameda were behind these sells. And he goes on to explain exactly how all this happened. But basically, he is attributing this withdrawal of 75 million of staked ETH. That's the derivative instrument that's providing the liquidity in Ethereum staking. He's saying 2 mystery wallets withdrew a bunch of staked ETH from FTX, helping to contribute, kicking off, in his words, this depegging event of the derivative instrument, which was a contributing factor to the demise of Celsius and 3AC. That's a huge ramification for 2 pretty large institutions. Like, now we know the fate of Celsius and 3AC, but at the time they were very large crypto institutions. Down here says the June staked ETH DPEG event led to a significant stress in the market and many rumors of Celsius liquidity problems. Celsius announced just 4 days after the Alameda staked ETH sells that it was halting withdrawals. And here you can see the kind of coverage they got. How the Celsius liquidity crunch is linked to Lido's staked Ethereum. A core piece of Celsius's earn strategy relies on staked ETH not losing parity with Ethereum, but it has, and now customers want their money back. So when we hear people saying that Ethereum has liquid staking too, they're sort of forgetting what happened last summer. It's like, yeah, you can achieve some level of liquidity there, but it's in this derivative instrument, which has depegged from Ether in the past. This is, in my opinion, significantly worse than true liquid staking. True liquid staking is far superior in that you're still holding on to your assets. You don't have this depegging risk that we know has actually occurred in the past. Here's a great thread explaining why Cardano can have these events like we recently had, where nodes go offline and Cardano seems to be just fine. Everything sort of automatically resets and we don't really lose anything and we just sort of carry on with business. And it's not really a big deal at the end of the day. Whereas in an ecosystem like Solana, they have these outages where nodes go offline and everything's crazy and they have to restart the network, and it is a big deal. So the difference really lies in the consensus protocol of these two different types of blockchains: Nakamoto consensus blockchains like Bitcoin and Cardano, and BFT consensus blockchains like Cosmos, Solana, and Aptos. And we've talked about the difference between these consensus protocols before, a long time ago on this channel. But you can think of it like this for these purposes. In Nakamoto consensus, as long as any pool or miner is online, because you can have both a proof of stake or a proof of work Nakamoto consensus blockchain, those don't determine the consensus protocol. But as long as any pool or miner is online, they will publish new blocks and the chain keeps growing, just slower in the case of pools or miners going offline, as long as any pool or miner is still online. In a BFT consensus blockchain, a quorum of votes is required to finalize a block. And this is unachievable if too many validators go offline. So this makes sense. In BFT consensus, you have a quorum. You have to have so many validators online in order to have a quorum to finalize a block. And if too many go offline, you can't reach that threshold. You can't form a quorum, so you can't add new blocks to the chain. So everything kind of grinds to a halt. Whereas in Nakamoto consensus, as long as any pool or miner is online, you can keep going and it's not the end of the world. So you might ask, why do they even have this quorum in BFT consensus then? And the answer is because they're trying to deal with this problem when you have a partition of the network, when, half of the validators are talking to each other and the other half are only talking to the other half and they're not talking to each other. If you could have a problem. So it looks kind of like this. So if you have a network partition event where half of them are talking to each other and the other half are talking to them, in the case of BFT consensus, they can't form a quorum because neither group is large enough. So there's no blocks committed to the chain. In Nakamoto consensus, you could have each half of the partitioned blockchain, each group of validators, each committing sort of competing blocks that are now conflicting with each other. They're each forming blocks, and they're not in unity here. So if you want to find out how Ouroboros Praus and Ouroboros Genesis that'll come in the future. Ouroboros Praus is here now. We're operating under Ouroboros Praus. In the future, it'll be Ouroboros Genesis. If you want to find out how they solve this problem for Cardano while remaining in the Nakamoto consensus world, you can go ahead and read through this thread and find out all about that, especially by following these links down here to the actual papers on Ouroboros Praus and Ouroboros Genesis. Finally, Coty has released a new article today on Djed, and it has some things in it that might surprise some people. So the big ones there, I think, are the minimums. So we've got a Djed minting minimum of 5,000 Djed, a Djed burning minimum of 1,000 Djed. We've got a mint burn fee of 1.5%, Shen minting 5,000, Shen burning 2,500. These are pretty large amounts. These are pretty big chunks. And of course, you could say, hey, these aren't the only ways that people are going to be able to acquire or dispose of Djed or Shen. You'll have the secondary markets as well. And I'm sure that's the way Coty is thinking about it as well. The mint and burn fee on Shen will be 1.5%, matching that Djed fee. The Djed and Shen mint burn operational fees will be 100 ADA. They say Shen's minimal price was set to 1 ADA to ensure that it is always redeemable for ADA, even in Lovelace units. So people were definitely a little surprised about these minimums. Seemed very large, especially in the case of this 5,000 Djed, 5,000 Shen minimum minting number. The other big surprise in this article had to do with delegation rewards for Shen holders. And this is starting from day one. So they're going to have delegation kind of built into the protocol. That's not the giant surprise. I think that was kind of expected by a lot of people. Here's the surprise. This ADA, so this is the ADA that will be deposited to the reserve for minting Shen. So you deposit ADA into the reserve and you can mint Shen, become a Shen holder. They say this ADA that's deposited to the reserve will be delegated to a dedicated public staking pool operated by Wave Financial, one of the most reputable stake pool operators in the Cardano network. Of course, Wave Financial is the entity that is a partner in the C Fund, but we should take a look at Wave Financial, the stake pool. So unfortunately, Wave Financial falls right here in the sort of donut presentation of Cardano stake pools, and they are definitely inside the minimum attack vector. They are one of the very largest multi-stake pool operators. According to this chart, at least, you've got Binance, Avengers, and then you've got Wave with 16 pools. Binance has 62, Avengers has 46, and then you've got Wave, which has 16, and this chart shows them at 3.3%. This is definitely, by delegating to a multi-pool operator, such a very large one inside the MAV, it's hard to argue that Coty and Djed aren't just contributing to the further centralization of our stake pool ecosystem. So a lot of people are not happy with this decision. We'll see how all this pans out, if they just sort of continue down that path or if they sort of respond to the criticism and decide to go in a different direction. Obviously, it's a business. They're running a business. Wave Financial's running a business. So, they'll do what they please. But yeah, I think this is not a very welcome development from a lot of people inside the ecosystem. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.